This biography is about a woman named Marie Tharp who really has done something extraordinary, but none of us have heard of her before. So now we know that under the ocean there are mountains as high as Mount Everest, and there are valleys, and there are all kinds of landforms of different sizes and shapes. But for a long time, everyone just assumed that the ocean was kind of flat. And so Marie Tharp is this woman who her parents like take her all over when she's a kid, and they do all sorts of things. And when she goes to college, she studies things that like at that point in time people thought were like good classes for girls to study. But she also takes a class in drafting, and she realizes she's really good at drafting. And she takes classes in geology, and she really likes studying about how rocks are formed. And after she graduates, she decides to go get her master's degree in petroleum geology, because at this point, a lot of men are away fighting in World War II. And so she goes and studies petroleum geology, and she gets a job even in Tulsa. She moves to Oklahoma, but then she doesn't really like that job, and so she decides to move to New York City. And when she gets there, this lab is hiring someone to help trace coordinates of ships in the ocean. And so Marie takes that job, and she begins to map where all these ships are in the ocean, and they're measuring depths in the ocean. And she starts making a map of the ocean using her drafting skills and her knowledge of cartography and geology. And she starts to notice that there is a V shape popping up in the map, like along the same line. And she tells the research scientists that she thinks that there is a mountain range in the Atlantic Ocean, and they don't believe her. And she is just very persistent, and they still don't believe her. Well, eventually something happens that kind of proves Marie's theory, and she is proven to be right. And so this is her biography about how she discovered mountains under the sea and proved to the world that did exist. And she also helped prove theories of like continental drift. So if you like science and biographies and learning about landforms, then I think you will like this biography called Marie's Ocean. Hey Roadrunners, today I'm going to tell you about a few books. The first book is the book that we see right here. It's called Above the Rim, How Elgin Baylor Changed Basketball. And it is about a real person named Elgin Baylor who grew up in the 1940s and 50s. He grew up in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C. at that time, most of the parks were segregated, so black people and white people could not go to the same parks. And Elgin and his friends sometimes would sneak into the white parks in Washington, D.C. so that they could use the good basketball courts. Eventually, in the first part of the story, you see that they are able to have a park installed in Elgin's neighborhood, and he plays so good basketball, like people will stop and watch him because that's how good he was and how different he played from anybody else. And people would ask him all the time, where did you get those moves? And he would just he couldn't tell them. He would just say, I don't know, it just comes natural. Elgin, he goes on to play college basketball, and he is recruited in the first round draft. He's the first pick of the draft, and he's picked by the Lakers at this time, who are in Minneapolis or something like that, something crazy like that. Well, Elgin, he goes on and he plays in the NBA, and he pretty quickly becomes a well-known player because he still plays like nobody else has ever played before, and people love to come watch him play. Well, what happens in the story is that Elgin is really affected by discrimination throughout the United States. Just like when he was a kid and he wasn't able to play in those parks in Washington, D.C., he finds that when he goes to a hotel, he is not accepted with his teammates. He's told that they have to stay somewhere else. When they go to a restaurant, he's told that he can't eat there, and all the rest of his teammates can. This does not really sit well with Baylor, and he has to make a decision. And the book becomes pretty serious because Elgin Baylor, he sees that his decision can have really great consequences for lots of people, not just himself. Because at the same time that Elgin is like dealing with this, Rosa Parks is beginning to see the start of the Montgomery bus boycotts. The sit-in movements are starting throughout the South, and the civil rights movement is starting to really build up. And so Elgin knows that he has to draw a line in the sand. And so after he is discriminated against, he does not suit up for the basketball game. He puts on his suit and tie, he goes and sits on the bench, and the spectators are really upset because they came to see the whole team play, and they came to especially see Elgin play because he plays like nobody else. This has really big consequences that you see in the book that change things for Baylor, for NBA players today, and really for all of us as citizens in this country. I think that you'll like this book because it's really serious and thoughtful and deals with topics that we hear a lot about, but maybe we don't know how great they affected everything about life in the United States. And one of the things I also really like about this book is that it has really big and bold illustrations, as you can see here. And the pages really just use sparing text. And I think that you will like this story about Elgin Baylor. So it was called Above the Rim, How Elgin Baylor Changed Basketball, and it was by Jen Bryant and illustrated by Frank Morrison.